Please welcome Naveen Bisht, who's the moderator for this panel, and he's the founder and CEO of Akitra. And the three speakers here are Kapil Chabbra, the co-founder and CPO for WisdomAI, Syona Sarma, the director for hardware, compute, and acceleration at Cloudflare, and TR Vishwanath, the co-founder and CTO at Glean. So please give them a hand.
Thank you. We have a distinguished panel of our experts who are working in the cutting-edge technologies in the GenAI area. So I'd like to, Kapil and Vish, they are founders of, I call it the leading-edge GenAI company, and they will be talking more on that area. And Syona is building some very cutting-edge hardware stuff at Cloudflare. And my background has been in the security area. So, starting 20 years ago with a firewall security company, and currently I'm founder and CEO of Akitra, which is a cybersecurity compliance platform. So we'll just right away get into our questions. And, you already heard from our previous speakers and from the last Rishi and Varun as well, how this Gen AI is fueling innovation as well as also bringing a lot of challenges in the organizations. And we basically, so let's start with the basic question: what is Gen AI security and what are the challenges involved with it? So how about Vish, you want to get going?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. It's an honor being here. When I think of Gen AI security, from my background, it's more about how do you, if you are a company, if you are building a Gen AI application or you're deploying a Gen AI application to your enterprise, what are some of the security concerns you should have in mind? I think one of the questions from the previous panel is spot on. Like Gen AI is all about training data, giving data to the model. And so one of the first things is how do you safeguard the integrity of that data? How do you lock down the access? How do you make sure the data does not have things that you don't want to feed the model, like PII or sensitive information that doesn't need to be sent? Then the second thing is around, so typically people don't host their own models. A lot of the model providers provide easy APIs that you can use for Gen AI. And so then you have to be aware of how that the model provider is using your data and your engagement. What's the retention policy? Is your data and engagement going to be used to train models that can be used by other customers? So just be cognizant of that. Then the another aspect is around like permissions. Like the LLM has no notion of what data is under access control or not. So if you give the data to the model and the API, is just going to generate a response. And the onus is on you, if you're building a Gen AI application, to be aware of what data you're giving to the model. Can the person who's using your application have access to that data? So thinking about your internal controls and data governance around that. Fourth thing is, just like you had SQL injection attacks for web applications, now you have a whole thing around prompt injection. If you're building a Gen AI application and then you take untrusted user input and add it to your prompt, then it can be used, attackers can use that to influence the response in ways that are not compliant with what you intend to do. So those are all like a few different considerations for either when you're building internal enterprise applications, Gen AI applications for your efficiency, like for making your workflows more efficient, or you're deploying someone else's application to the enterprise. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Vish. Kapil, would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Vish broke it down pretty nicely. The way I think about it is there are three aspects to security and privacy around this, right? There's what is the data that is going into the model, and then the second one is the model itself. The third one is what is the data coming out of the model. So if you kind of think about it in these three very simple terms, The data going into the model, the concerns and considerations, of course, are, is that data going to be used for some malicious activity? Am I going to lose that data to somebody else? For the model itself, it's more traditional. Like, kind of think about it as, in a layman's term, like a traditional database. You want to build all the privacy and the security around that so you don't lose the model, because that's a new type of a database for your data. And the third aspect of who gets to access that data, what's this information coming out of it? As Vish pointed out, and in the previous panel as well, there's no notion of controls or ACLs in that data. So there has to be some more application that has to be built on top of it to control what data is being accessed by which person. So that's kind of a simplistic framework that how we think about security and privacy in this age of GenAI.
More on the hardware infrastructure side, so what kind of security considerations you think one should look into while leveraging these applications?
Up on the keynote about the multi-cloud approach that most people are taking today, where you're training, it may be in one cloud, you're running, this data is being stored in a different cloud, and you're running inference in a different place. It's important to keep in mind that these transitions is where you're most vulnerable to attacks, because each of the clouds may have different ways of managing their infrastructure and their security controls, authentication, etc. And they may not all be consistent with each other. So isolating your workloads is something to keep in mind, and also being very conscious of where your endpoints are going to land and how secure they are is something to think about. So just to put a frame around the infrastructure considerations while choosing where to run your models or your applications, I would just go off of what we were just talking about in terms of the data itself. So from a hardware perspective, we think about it as data at rest, data in transit, and data in use. Those are the three things that we want to be protecting. Data at rest, most importantly, is protected using encryption techniques. So when you're choosing infrastructure or memory solutions to store your data, you want to understand what their key management solutions look like. Are they using a hardware security module under the hood of their infrastructure? Data in transit, data in use also comes with the security protocols, authentication methods of who's able to access this data, how are they verifying identity, and things like that. When it comes to the models themselves, it's again, the models being encrypted, and when you're accessing data from one model to another, and maybe you're doing some sort of a fine-tuning application for a custom workload, how do you make sure that the encryption mechanisms that are being used for this different use case map? So from a model's perspective, understanding encryption, understanding version control, I think would be two things to think about. For the infrastructure itself, it starts with the hardware. It's the servers and the data centers. So it's physical, and physical tampering is a big risk. And if any of you have been to a data center, you'll notice sometimes that there are racks of a different company in the same vicinity. So it's important to understand how reputable the company is in terms of where they source their hardware, where their data centers are located. Do they have tamper-proof abilities, alert controls? How do they manage these risks? And then when you're deploying on the infrastructure, you can prevent these attacks, but without continuous monitoring, you're not going to be able to catch some of these malignant actors from accessing your data. So bots management, VPNs, firewalls, we've talked about them, especially in the age of LLMs. The firewall designs have to change because they're non-deterministic in nature. And when you're building a firewall, typically your control plane and data plane are separate enough to be able to identify attack signatures, which is not the case with LLMs. So making sure you have a firewall if you're in the GenAI space is another thing to think through. So all of these should be services that are managed by the infrastructure provider. So understanding how comprehensive their solutions are is another thing to keep in mind as you choose the infrastructure that you run on.
Thank you, Syona. So as you know, the innovation in this space is happening very rapidly. So one of the challenges for companies is how do you balance the innovation and at the same time keep data security in mind? So when you talk to your customers, so what do you kind of tell them and what to look out for or how they should go about it? So either of you can start.
It's a very interesting question. We hear this all the time. It's actually pretty much an unknown beast for most organizations at this time. It's not known how well an organization is able to leverage it. And whatever happens, right, this from the organization's perspective, when a new thing is getting introduced, it introduces some additional kind of risk in the system. And that's what organizations are thinking about, right? CIOs, CISOs are thinking about what risk is getting introduced when I'm bringing in a net new piece of technology into the system. And as we start to define the frameworks around those risks and trying to understand what are the different layers, how can I peel this off, how can I understand and comprehend, and maybe even control my intellectual property with this new system, is what everybody is concerned about. So like security of the data, privacy of the data, governance of the output of the data, and of course compliance are 4 key aspects.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the one suggestion that I have is when you're just getting started with GenAI, you can also think about, am I going to train my own model? Am I going to host my own model for performance and cost, advantages? But then it comes with its own class of security issues to deal with. So one simplification is just there are great APIs, there are great model providers. So start on the product market fit and the use case. And then later on think of optimizing it. And then there are some standard security things you need to worry about. Like for example, if you're building an application using an API and you're using the API, you have to be careful about really securing the API keys and having isolation between the different use cases that you're using AI for, because if it falls in the hands of the wrong person, first of all, they can run up your cost like anything, and they can abuse the API as well. And the biggest thing, when we talk to customers about Glean and they are thinking about deploying it into their workplace, one of the biggest concerns that security teams have is lack of visibility into both what data is being used for being provided to the AI, as well as what are the responses that are being returned by the AI, and whether that violates their compliance and governance rules, like you said. So I think the thing there is understanding your data posture. You have tools like DLP software and so on that can help you understand the risks around the data. Is sensitive data being overshared in your company, for example, is one of the big things that people think about when deploying GenAI software.
So how do you see, you talked about a little bit on the governance and compliance side, and there are some new standards which have come up. There is a new standard which came in December, which is by International Standard Organization, ISO 42001, and then you have this NIST, RMF, which is the AI Risk Management Framework. So do you, when you're building your own applications or selling it to your customers, so how do you address, or are they asking for you to ensure that your applications are compliant with it, or do you building some of the guidance provided in those frameworks into your applications?
Yeah, so just for everybody's awareness, there's two standards on AI that are under kind of construction right now. There's some early drafts of these. What Naveen is mentioning is the ISO 42001, which is an international standard. And then there is a NIST risk management framework as well. That's more of a US-based kind of thing that coming out of the executive order from President Biden. So both of these essentially are trying to say that, hey, these are the list of roughly 400 kind of checkpoints that every organization could leverage in understanding and taming this beast. That here are the things of risk. And whatever application that you bring in, try to measure those against these 400 bullet points. And then you will understand what kind of risk are you actually introducing. So this NIST RMF is actually risk management framework because it's helping organizations manage the risk. So from our perspective, we have not seen a lot of maturity around these, and organizations have not been asking about these just yet. What we see is organizations have created their own questionnaire around understanding the architecture of how the applications have been built. So they can discern it themselves on what risk they are introducing in the organizations. I do expect that these standards will become more popular, more stable, and more robust over time. So I do expect, just like other security standards, these standards also becoming more and more prevalent in the organizations.
Yeah.
We're also seeing the same thing, not asking for these standards, but they have their own questionnaires that we fill in.
So one, I mean, I know you have given some guidance to the audience who's in terms of the security and the governance considerations. So what could be some of the best practices, let's say 3 best practices you can talk about which can enhance the data security as well as privacy measures for those using these applications? So either of you can start.
All right, let me start. So best practices, this is an exciting time. All right, there's so much that these AI models can provide us. So my guidance is actually to embrace it with open arms, not just because I'm building a company using some of that, but also because there's a lot of potential. At the same time, keep this risk in mind. There is a lot of unknown around how some of these models are getting trained and used. So it is important to really understand what kind of risk is getting introduced in the organization. But as Rishi mentioned previously, be positive around this. This is an exciting time.
+1 to that, and the other thing is just as you introduce this and as you sort of enable teams in your company to use GenAI, I think it's important to invest a little bit in the guardrails around this, right? So I think the thing that we keep hearing is just understanding visibility, observability into the data and the access that the different AI solutions are going to have, and then the similarly auditing and understanding when it is doing a bad job. So having some amount of auditing and logging for that. Yeah.
Syona, would you like any practices from infrastructure perspective? You want to?
Yeah, sure. I think one pointer is to think about data localization. And if you're choosing an infrastructure that has a global presence, like Cloudflare does, we're noticing that some customers like to train within the region where their data exists to reduce the risk of transit, right? So something to keep in mind as you start building out your specific use case, choosing an infrastructure provider like that might be beneficial.
Okay, thank you. So we have just like a minute left. So if there is any question in the audience, if anyone wants to ask, this is the time. Oh, there is one question. Okay, please go ahead. If you can speak loud enough, or shall I?
Sure. Yeah, I should be fine. I just had a question. If you could talk about, you said like ensuring that your API keys are safely stored in like a good place. I'm kind of new to the whole telegram, so you could talk a little bit more about how an entrepreneur should like effectively like store that sensitive information? Because I know there was a startup called Grip Tape that has a lot of this sensitive information, and I think thousands of dollars worth of their compute was lost, basically, just because someone had access to the API key. I don't know how, but if you could talk a little bit more about like how someone should think about like storing that safely.
Yeah, there are a lot of solutions. Like if you use any of the cloud providers like GCP or AWS and so on for your for building your application and running them, like they all provide like secure secret managers that you can use, and you can even have like depending on how secure you want it to be, you can even have the keys be stored in a hardware device. But most applications don't need that. You just have you use the secret manager that comes with your cloud, with the cloud provider you're going with, and that should be enough in terms of security, like locking down the access to that secret.
One quick tip, do not put that in your code. There you go. From Okta's perspective, I'm sure Monica can add a lot more. Do not put it on the code. Also, do not put it in a prompt that you send to the LLM. Some basic stuff.
Or
Just something to add from an infrastructure perspective. You want to understand what the failover mechanisms are for where you're either storing or running the data, and make sure they have some sort of high availability or disaster recovery mechanisms. Usually the reputed cloud providers, infrastructure will give you that, right? Another way to look at it is to just look at that track record of incident responses, because these things happen. Have they been transparent about things that have happened in the past? How have they handled it, fixed it, etc. Is also a good way to evaluate them.
all right. Let's give a big round of applause to Syona, Bisht, and Kapil. Thank you.